When we think about what shapes human history, we usually point to ideas, leaders, wars, or beliefs. We talk about revolutions, religions, and empires rising and falling through ambition or ideology. But beneath these visible forces lies something far quieter and far more consistent. Long before ideas spread or armies marched, human societies were shaped by material systems, the basic structures that made daily life possible. Food production, storage, transport, tools, energy, and infrastructure did not just support civilization. They shaped how civilization thought, organized itself, and exercised power. These systems rarely appear in heroic stories because they do not announce themselves. They work slowly, repeatedly, and impersonally. Yet once a society becomes dependent on a material system, that system begins to influence behavior, priorities, and limits. To understand why civilizations develop similar patterns across different cultures and eras, we must look beyond events and ask a deeper question. Not who ruled, but what systems quietly structured everyday life, and how those systems shaped history long before or anyone noticed their influence. The earliest material systems emerged not from planning or ideology, but from necessity. Humans needed reliable food, shelter, and tools to survive beyond immediate scarcity. Small innovations, irrigation channels, storage pits, simple roads began as practical solutions to local problems. But once adopted, they altered behavior in lasting ways. Communities organized labor around planting cycles. Storage changed how risk was managed. Paths between settlements turned occasional contact into regular exchange. These developments did more than improve survival. They introduced structure. Time became regulated by seasons. Space became organized by access. Over generations, these arrangements hardened into expectations. People planned their lives around systems, rather than improvisation. What began as adaptation slowly became dependency. At that point, material systems stopped being neutral. They began to shape who could grow, who could trade, and who could endure disruption. Without conquest or decree, they quietly selected winners and losers, setting trajectories that would define societies long before formal institutions or political authority appeared. As these material systems expanded, they began to generate power even without intention. Control did not initially come from ownership, but from coordination. Someone had to decide when irrigation channels were repaired, how storage was shared, which paths were maintained. These decisions created influence, not because they were coercive, but because they affected outcomes. Over time, those who managed systems gained leverage over those who depended on them. This marked a critical transition. Authority emerged not from force, but from administration. The ability to organize material flows became more important than the ability to impose will. Once this shift occurred, power no longer needed to be dramatic. It could be quiet, procedural, and routine. Systems enforced themselves through dependence. Those who followed their logic prospered. Those who resisted faced exclusion or instability. In this way, material systems trained societies to accept structure before they accepted rulers, laying the foundations for governance long before political theory or law attempted to explain it. Over time, material systems began to shape not just authority, but perception itself. When daily survival depends on infrastructure, people start to see the world through the lens of maintenance and continuity. Stability becomes a priority. Disruption becomes a threat. Decisions are judged less by their moral intent and more by their impact on systems that sustain life. This subtle shift matters. Societies organized around material systems tend to value order over spontaneity and predictability over risk. Innovation is welcomed only when it does not endanger existing flows. In this way, systems quietly discipline thought. They define what seems practical, realistic, or acceptable. What appears to be cultural preference is often structural conditioning. Material systems do not tell people what to believe, but they shape what beliefs can survive. Over generations, this influence becomes invisible, embedded in common sense. History then appears to be driven by ideas and leaders, when in reality, those ideas and leaders are operating within boundaries drawn long before by the systems beneath them. As material systems grew more complex, they began to connect distant regions into shared dependencies. Roads linked production to consumption. Storage connected surplus to scarcity. Tools and infrastructure synchronized labor across time and space. These connections reduced isolation, but increased vulnerability. When systems functioned well, they created prosperity and stability. When they failed, disruption spread quickly and unevenly. This introduced a new dynamic into history. Collapse no longer required invasion. A broken canal, a failed harvest, or an interrupted supply could weaken societies from within. Power shifted toward those who could prevent breakdown, repair damage, and coordinate response. Resilience became as important as strength. Over time, civilizations that mastered maintenance outlasted those that pursued expansion alone. Material systems rewarded continuity, foresight, and coordination, shaping historical outcomes quietly but decisively. They turned survival into a collective process, binding societies together through shared dependence, long before anyone recognized these systems as forces of history. This dependence on material systems gradually changed how societies responded to crisis. In earlier eras, disruption was often met with movement migration, conflict, or collapse. As systems deepened, responses became internal. Communities sought repair rather than escape. Authorities focused on restoration rather than conquest. The priority shifted from reacting to events to stabilizing processes. This required new forms of organization, record-keeping, scheduling, standards, and oversight. None of these emerged to express power symbolically. They emerged because systems needed care. Over time, the ability to manage breakdown became a source of legitimacy. Those who could restore flow gained trust. Those who could not lost relevance. This marked a quiet turning point in history. Power became associated with competence rather than dominance. Material systems did not eliminate conflict, but they redefined success. Winning increasingly meant keeping things working. In this way, maintenance replaced heroism as the hidden engine of historical endurance. As material systems settled into the background of daily life, their influence became harder to question and easier to forget. People rarely notice systems when they function smoothly. Roads, tools, storage, and supply networks faded into routine. Attention shifted to visible actors, leaders, laws, and conflicts, while the structures that made action possible remained unexamined. This invisibility was itself a form of power. Systems that go unnoticed are rarely challenged. They define normalcy. When choices are shaped by access, timing, and infrastructure, alternatives feel unrealistic rather than forbidden. Over time, societies internalize these limits as common sense. What could not be supported by existing systems was dismissed as impractical, regardless of intent. In this way, material systems quietly narrowed the range of historical possibilities. They did not dictate outcomes directly, but they shaped which outcomes were achievable. History then appears driven by human will, when in fact that will is constantly filtered through the structures that sustain everyday life. This filtering effect explains why different civilizations, separated by geography and culture, often developed similar patterns over time. Centralization followed surplus, hierarchy followed coordination, bureaucracy followed complexity. These outcomes were not copied from one society to another. They emerged independently because material systems imposed similar constraints. Large-scale irrigation required collective labor. Storage demanded accounting. Transport needed regulation. Each solution introduced new layers of organization, and each layer reduced spontaneity while increasing stability. Over generations, these structures became embedded in social life, shaping norms, expectations, and authority. What appears, in retrospect, as a deliberate political design was often the unintended result of managing material necessity. Material systems did not push societies toward a single destiny, but they narrowed the field of viable options. In doing so, they quietly guided human history along familiar paths, regardless of culture or belief. The influence of material systems also extended into social relationships and identity. As systems standardized production and exchange, they reduced the importance of personal ties and local customs in favor of predictable rules. Trust shifted from individuals to processes. People no longer relied solely on who they knew, but on whether systems functioned as expected. This transformation reshaped social order. Roles became specialized. Status became linked to access rather than lineage. Those positioned near key systems storage centers, transport hubs, workshops gained influence, while those on the margins became more vulnerable. Over time, this produced new forms of inequality that were structural rather than personal. Advantage was no longer just inherited or seized. It was embedded in position within a system. Material systems thus reorganized society quietly, redefining success and security without overt conflict. By altering how people related to one another and to resources, these systems shaped social hierarchies long before ideology or law attempted to justify them. As material systems reshaped social order, they also changed how power justified itself. Authority no longer needed to rely solely on tradition, charisma, or force. It could point to function. Leaders and institutions claimed legitimacy by keeping systems running, by ensuring food arrived, tools were available, and disruptions were managed. This practical performance became a powerful source of acceptance. When systems worked, authority felt earned. When they failed, legitimacy eroded quickly, regardless of ideology. This created a feedback loop between material reliability and political stability. Governments that invested in infrastructure and maintenance gained resilience. Those that neglected it faced unrest, not because people suddenly questioned beliefs, but because daily life became uncertain. In this way, material systems tied this performance-based legitimacy introduced a new kind of fragility into historical systems. When authority is tied to material reliability, even small disruptions can carry political consequences. A delayed harvest, a broken road, or a failed tool supply might appear technical, yet they ripple outward, undermining confidence. Unlike ideological challenges, these failures are difficult to argue against. They are experienced directly. As societies became more system-dependent, tolerance for malfunction decreased. Expectations rose. People no longer asked whether rulers were just, but whether systems worked. This raised the stakes of governance. Power became quieter, but also more exposed. It depended not on spectacle, but on continuous function. Material systems thus imposed discipline on authority itself, forcing leaders to prioritize maintenance over ambition. Those who ignored this reality often discovered that collapse did not come from rebellion or invasion, but from erosion of trust caused by everyday breakdowns. Over long periods, This erosion reshaped how civilizations understood failure. Collapse was no longer seen as a sudden event caused by enemies or disasters alone. It appeared instead as a gradual loss of capacity. Systems that once absorbed stress began to transmit it. Maintenance was deferred, coordination weakened. Small failures accumulated until recovery became impossible. This pattern repeated across eras because it was structural, not cultural. Material systems require constant care, yet their success often leads societies to take them for granted. Investment shifts elsewhere. Attention drifts toward visible achievements. By the time dysfunction becomes obvious, the system is already fragile. In this way, material systems quietly set the tempo of history. They determine not only how societies grow, but how they decline. Collapse, when it comes, is often the final expression of long-neglected infrastructure rather than the result of a single dramatic cause. Seen from this perspective, material systems act as the hidden timetable of history. They move slowly, but they set limits that events cannot escape. Leaders rise and fall within those limits. Ideas spread only where systems allow them to circulate. Even conflict follows the contours of infrastructure, supply, and capacity. This is why similar historical outcomes emerge across very different societies. The specifics change, but the underlying pressures remain. Once populations grow large and interdependent, material systems become the primary constraint on possibility. They define how fast societies can move, how much stress they can absorb, and how far authority can extend. Understanding history through this lens does not diminish human agency, but it places it in context. Choices matter, but they matter within structures built long before those choices are made. Material systems quietly shape that context, guiding history not through command, but through the boundaries of what can realistically endure. This is why moments of apparent historical freedom are often more constrained than they seem. Revolutions promise transformation, reforms promise renewal, and leaders promise change. Yet the material systems beneath society rarely change at the same pace. Roads, supply networks, energy sources, and production methods impose inertia. They limit how quickly new ideas can be implemented and how far they can spread. Even radical shifts are forced to adapt to existing structures. Over time, this creates a pattern where surface change appears dramatic, but underlying systems remain largely intact. History then feels cyclical, not because people lack imagination, but because material constraints persist. Systems outlast ideologies. They absorb new narratives and continue shaping outcomes quietly. This does not mean change is impossible. It means change is slower, negotiated, and often redirected by the practical realities of infrastructure and capacity. Material systems do not resist transformation openly. They simply define the terms under which it can occur. As material systems persist, they begin to shape not only what changes, but what societies choose to protect. Over time, priorities shift toward preserving functionality rather than pursuing ideals. Stability becomes a shared goal across political divisions, because disruption threatens everyone dependent on the system. This creates a quiet conservatism rooted not in ideology, but in infrastructure. People may disagree about values, but they agree about the need for roads to function, food to arrive, and energy to flow. Material systems thus generate consensus without debate. They narrow political conflict by defining non-negotiable necessities. In doing so, they stabilize societies while also limiting imagination. Power operates most effectively here, not by enforcing obedience, but by aligning survival with continuity. History moves forward, but along channels carved by systems that societies are unwilling or unable to abandon. This alignment between survival and continuity explains why material systems often become invisible centers of power. They do not need symbols or ceremonies. Their authority is reinforced every time daily life proceeds without interruption. When water flows, when food arrives, when tools function, the system justifies itself. People adapt expectations around this reliability, planning futures that assume continuity. In such conditions, questioning the system feels risky, even irrational. Alternatives are judged not by their ideals, but by whether they can match existing performance. Material systems thus shape political imagination by setting a baseline of acceptability. They do not suppress dissent directly, but they raise the cost of disruption. Power, in this form, is quiet and resilient. It persists not because it is imposed, but because it is depended upon. History moves forward within this dependence, guided less by force than by function. Across civilizations, this pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. Whether in ancient irrigation societies, industrial economies, or modern digital networks, material systems follow the same trajectory. They begin as solutions, expand into structures, and eventually become foundations. Once foundational, they shape behavior at every level, from individual routines to state strategy. This continuity reveals something important about human history. Progress does not simply replace old systems with new ones, it layers them. New technologies are added on top of existing infrastructure, inheriting constraints rather than eliminating them. As a result, the past remains embedded in the present. Material systems act as carriers of history, preserving patterns of organization though their original context has faded. To understand why societies behave they do today, we must trace not only ideas and events, but the systems that quietly carried them forward through time. Material systems also help explain why power often appears stable until it suddenly is not. Because systems fail gradually, warning signs are easy to overlook. Small inefficiencies are tolerated, minor disruptions are normalized. Attention focuses on visible successes while underlying capacity erodes. By the time failure becomes obvious, options are limited, repair is costly, adaptation is slow. This creates the illusion of sudden collapse, when in reality decline has been unfolding for years within the system itself. History records these moments as turning points, but their causes lie deeper. Material systems determine how much stress a society can absorb before it breaks. When capacity falls below demand, instability follows, regardless of leadership or ideology. In this way, systems quietly decide when history accelerates, pushing societies from long stability into rapid change. Understanding material systems shifts how we interpret responsibility in history. Failures are often attributed to individuals, bad leaders, poor decisions, moral decline. While agency matters, it operates within structural limits. A leader cannot easily reverse decades of neglected infrastructure or restore trust in broken systems overnight. Material conditions constrain choice. They shape what is possible, regardless of intention. This perspective does not excuse failure, but it clarifies it. It shows why reform is difficult, why recovery takes time, and why repeated patterns emerge across different societies. Material systems create momentum. Once set in motion, they carry history forward along certain paths, resisting abrupt redirection. Power, in this sense, is not just exercised by people. It is embedded in the systems they inherit and manage, shaping outcomes long after individual actors have left the stage. By recognizing this, we gain a more grounded understanding of how history unfolds. Events matter, but they do not act alone. They interact with systems that amplify, dampen, or redirect their impact. Revolutions succeed or fail depending on material capacity. Empires expand or stall based on infrastructure. Economic change accelerates or stagnates according to underlying systems of production and distribution. Material systems are not the story of history, but they are the stage on which it plays out. They set limits, create incentives, and define risks. Ignoring them leads to explanations that feel dramatic but incomplete. Attending to them reveals why history so often moves slowly, then suddenly. It also reveals why similar outcomes recur, even when circumstances appear different. This perspective also alters how we think about progress itself. Progress is often measured in ideas, rights, or innovation. Yet without corresponding changes in material systems, these advances remain fragile. New rights depend on systems that can enforce them. New ideas spread only where infrastructure allows. Innovation requires supply, energy, and coordination to scale. Material systems determine whether progress consolidates or collapses under its own weight. They provide the capacity that allows societies to absorb change without breaking. When that capacity is absent, progress becomes uneven and unstable. History's advances, then, are not just intellectual achievements. They are logistical ones. They rest on systems that make continuity possible. Understanding this reveals why moments of rapid progress are rare, and why they often coincide with periods of material expansion and systemic reliability. Over time, material systems also shape how societies imagine the future. Expectations are formed around what systems can sustain. Ambitions are scaled to infrastructure. Plans assume continuity unless disruption forces reconsideration. This forward-looking influence is subtle but powerful. It channels investment, policy, and innovation toward what seems feasible rather than what is merely desirable. As a result, the future often resembles an extension of the present, modified at the margins rather than transformed entirely. Material systems act as anchors, stabilizing trajectories while limiting divergence. This does not eliminate creativity, but it frames it. The most successful changes are those that work with existing systems or gradually reshape them, rather than attempting abrupt replacement. History rewards adaptation that respects material reality. Seen together, these patterns reveal why material systems deserve more attention than they receive. They are not background conditions, they are active forces. They shape power by defining access, timing, and capacity. They shape society by organizing labor, distributing risk, and embedding inequality. They shape history by determining which paths are sustainable and which collapse under strain. Yet because they operate quietly, they are often overlooked in favor of more visible causes. This oversight leads to repeated surprise when systems fail or constrain change. Material systems do not announce their limits loudly. They reveal them through gradual friction. Recognizing their role allows us to read history with greater clarity, seeing continuity where others see chaos, and structure where others see coincidence. This way of understanding history does not reduce humanity to mechanics. It deepens our understanding of choice. Choices matter most when they align with material capacity, and they fail when they ignore it. Leaders who succeed often do so not because they are visionary, but because they understand systems. They invest in maintenance. They anticipate strain. They respect limits. Those who fail often overestimate will and underestimate structure. Material systems quietly reward realism and punish neglect. History records these outcomes as success or failure, but the underlying logic remains consistent. Systems do not care about intention. They respond to pressure, capacity, and care. In this sense, material systems are among the most impartial forces shaping human history. Ultimately, material systems remind us that civilization is a collective achievement sustained through coordination rather than command. Roads, tools, storage, and infrastructure are shared achievements that bind societies together. They require trust, cooperation, and long-term commitment. When these conditions hold, societies flourish. When they erode, fragmentation follows. Power emerges from the ability to sustain this coordination, not from dominance alone. Material systems make this possible by aligning individual survival with collective function. They teach societies how to live together at scale. In doing so, they quietly shape history, guiding it through structures that endure longer than any rule or idea. Looking across centuries, the influence of material systems becomes unmistakable. They explain why civilizations with different beliefs develop similar institutions. They explain why decline often follows neglect rather than defeat. They explain why recovery is slow and stability precious. Material systems are the deep currents beneath historical events. They move slowly, but they carry everything above them. To ignore them is to misunderstand the forces that shape human experience over the long term. To study them is to gain insight into the true mechanics of history. This insight carries a quiet implication for the present. Modern societies rely on material systems of unprecedented scale and complexity. Energy grids, supply chains, data networks, and infrastructure shape daily life in ways that mirror earlier systems, but with far greater reach. The same patterns apply. Stability depends on maintenance. Power depends on coordination. Failure emerges gradually before it becomes visible. Understanding how material systems shape the past offers a framework for interpreting the present, not by predicting events, but by recognizing constraints. History does not repeat exactly, but systems often rhyme. In the end, material systems quietly shape human history because they define what societies can sustain. They set the boundaries within which ideas compete, leaders act, and events unfold. They do not eliminate choice, but they give it form. By tracing these systems, we see a different history emerge, one less focused on drama and more on durability. A history where power grows from coordination, where collapse begins with neglect, and where continuity matters more than conquest. Understanding material systems does not simplify history, it makes it legible. And in that clarity, the hidden structure of human civilization finally comes into view.